Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the AP United States History Podcast. I am your host, Aaliyah Guzman, and today we are going to be talking about a very important event in history, one that's really scary, and I don't think many people are actually aware of the gravity that this situation held. I'm just saying that because I know I didn't know how serious it was until I learned about it. And so if I didn't know, then a lot of people probably also don't really know. Anyways, this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, background. When was the Cuban Missile Crisis and why was the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? So it happened in October 1962, and it was between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. So basically, the Cold War, they were obviously trying to not get into any sort of confrontation directly because they knew the type of bombs and missiles that they had, and they knew that if they were to launch any against each other or get into any sort of direct conflict, it would turn to that, and that's basically mutually assured destruction. So they didn't want that. But the United States found out that the Soviet Union was holding missiles in Cuba. And of course, if you know where Cuba is, it's 90 miles from Florida. And that's very close to the United States. So Kennedy was worried. He was like, why do they have these here? And why is it so close to us, So during this time, of course, since tensions were very tense, Kennedy didn't want to do anything to sort of provoke the Soviet Union to launch any type of nuclear war. And so he decided to announce a blockade around Cuba to prevent any more missiles from coming, missiles that were being shipped in from the Soviet Union from arriving in Cuba, because why would we want more? Why would we want more? And after that, the Soviet Union began to go on high alert, and the leader at the time, Khrushchev, was sending messages trying to propose deals, and so was Kennedy. And they said that they were going to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States promises not to invade. But the United States had also agreed to remove their missiles from Turkey that they had, because the Soviets were like, okay, we'll remove our missiles because obviously we don't want nuclear war to happen, but you have to also remove your missiles from Turkey because they're kind of close to us and they're also pointing at us. So, it's just fair. It's just a little fair. And so Kennedy agreed with this, but it wasn't made public at the time that Khrushchev announced that he was going to remove the missiles from Cuba, and it was just something that happened in the background, but it was very much one of the main factors for why that both sides got their missiles out of the different places. And finally, in October 28th, 1962, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba, and the crisis was over. But there were very close times during this whole negotiation that could have led to missiles being launched by the Soviets and by the United States. And so it's important because it shows just how closely the world came to nuclear war and destruction just because of political tension. And it's very interesting to think about how they could even have considered and why they would even build these bombs. Obviously, politics and getting to deal with conflicts, but it just shows sort of how power is held between certain countries and the lengths that people are willing to go to get their side on top. And this just highlights the importance of having diplomacy rather than aggression, because instead of rushing into war, we can see that both sides chose to negotiate because they knew that the decisions that went through negotiation would save millions of lives. And that's just very important. And even today, the Cuban Missile Crisis is studied as a key example, as we learned too, about leadership and pressure, because the pressure was very high and they were literally days away from launching these missiles, but gladly the resolution was made and it did not end up leading to a nuclear winter. And that's why I just think the Cuban Missile Crisis is something really important that we talk about, because we need to learn to go towards diplomacy rather than just immediate war and aggression, because if not, things can get very terrifying, and that goes in just any situation in daily life too, because while this is a huge global conflict, there are certain situations in our lives where we might think to go towards aggression, but it's not necessary. Just talking through is so important. But that's the end of this episode, and that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bye.